You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. I'm here to talk to you about, I don't even know what initiative it is anymore, but with me, as he is always, John Mills.
It's the money-making initiative by this point.
Oh, I like it.
That's all that it is. It's the money-making initiative, the chaotic travels through Phase 4 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. To borrow from Homer Simpson as he talks about being the sugar baron, the dizzying highs and the terrifying lows are all to be had here as we explore the MCU.
Well, we are going to be talking about another Disney Plus show here in Phase 4, which is Moon Knight, starring none other than Oscar Isaac. Before we get there, though, thanks for listening. We really appreciate it. You can get the entire 602 Club repertoire, all of the shows here in the feed, if you just subscribe wherever you're listening to this. We would also really appreciate it if you would give us a star rating and review over on Apple Podcasts. In fact, right now, we're trying to give away a free Spider-Man Across the Universe poster. We need, as of this recording, 19 more reviews before we can do the drawing for that. So enter, and you could win. It is for the U.S. store only, so please do that. And also, you got other places like Spotify and those type of places where you can give star ratings and things. Do that for us. It takes like 3 seconds to, give us a 5-star review. You can also find us all over social media. We would love to interact with you at the 602 Club, or we would love to interact with you on Instagram at the 602 Club TFM. You can find the entire network online at trek.fm. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/trekfm. There is a listeners-only discussion group. You can join that and talk to listeners from all over the world about all of the shows that we're doing here, as well as helping us out on Patreon at patreon.com/trekfm and making sure that all of your favorite shows here on the network can keep coming to you each and every week. But, John, I'm very interested to know where you were coming into Moon Knight in the first place. Because I know that, you're more familiar with the Marvel Comics than I am. You kind of grew up reading a lot more of the Marvel Comics than I did. And so, as we come into Moon Knight, was this a character you were familiar with? And, were you excited to kind of see what they would do?
Yeah, Moon Knight's a character I was excited to see them bring to screen. I knew that it was going to be different because just like Guardians of the Galaxy and various other characters, they've been reinvented over time. It's, the Bryan Michael Bendis rebirth of Marvel as a whole had happened. And, he came back, he retooled and updated different things. It's how we get Miles Morales and all these other nifty incarnations of things. And so that era, I'm not saying that it's just Bendis. There was a trove of creators in the mix there, but his name is the one I most associate with that. So I knew that Moon Knight was going to be a more updated version than I grew up with, but I loved Moon Knight growing up. The joke that friend of the show, Craigula, has said is he referred to him as Egyptian Batman. And I was like, that is actually a great description for the basic level of Moon Knight that we encountered in the 1980s. I think it was Werewolf by Night is actually where he made his first appearance or something like that. It was Werewolf by Night was the first appearance and was in the 70s. And then he got his own series. I think it started, it was 1980 or something like that. So that would have been where I would have been familiar with him, by raiding my brother's comic book stash, because he had all the Moon Knight titles. And one of the creators on that, Bill Sienkiewicz, tremendously influential artist on my own personal style and aesthetic, and what I like to look at in comics and everything, through time. So, all that to say, yes, you're right. I was more familiar with the character as a whole. I was excited that there was going to be a Moon Knight show. I was legitimately excited that there would be this.
Well, and that leads me to another question then, just because of that familiarity and that excitement. What is it about the character that you ended up loving with the comics that you read? I know you mentioned the fact that this is based off a newer interpretation of the character, but what is it that had helped you fall in love with this character back in the day?
Honestly, character design. Some people gravitate to comics for the stories. Some people gravitate for the art. Some people gravitate for both. Comic book reading for me when I was growing up was the first pass was paying very little attention to the words and going through and looking at the art. And if the art grabbed me, I would immediately become a dedicated fan. There was a great comic book, it was great for a little while, called The Nom, that came out in the 80s. That's one of those rare ones that grabbed me both with art and story, because it was actually somebody who had, first-person recollection of being in Vietnam during the conflict. And the art was very comic book, but incredibly well. I forget the artist's name. He did the infamous Marvel Star Wars comic that was a stand-in when they had to delay the Empire Strikes Back adaptation. I forget his name, but it was called Riders on the Void, was the name of that comic, if you want to go back and look at that. And I'm rambling at this point, but basically it was character design. And then from there, it was an interesting story. I mean, again, the joke being Egyptian Batman, it's like, I love Batman. Who doesn't love Batman? And it's like, oh, look, here's Batman with an even cooler costume. And he has certain rules that he has to follow. And it's, it's supernatural in nature and stuff like that. It's like, okay, go on. I'm paying attention. And so that's really what got me hooked with the character back then.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's really cool. And for myself, I know absolutely nothing about this character. So other than the name, right? I come in at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, which is, I think, a really interesting thing and a place for both of us to be as we kind of look back at this show. Because, one of the things that any comic book medium has to do these days on film or, on the small screen with TV shows is you have to be able to appeal to people who don't know anything about the character and be able to bring them into the world and make them want to see more. And so I think that puts us in the interesting ends of the spectrum. And so one of the biggest things about this character, of course, and this interpretation of the character is the fact that we have multiple personality disorder happening here. So I wanted to ask you how you feel like this show works that in and how that progresses. Because from the first episode onward, we are really treated to this, back and forth between Steven and Mark and trying to figure out what's going on, especially as we're getting it from Steven's perspective, and the possibility that something else is going on that neither of them understands. And so how do you feel like this does with, I would say, a rather sensitive subject, the idea of, multiple personality disorder?
I think it does it well. It starts off very well because it makes it very interesting. I like the touch that they have where he sort of starts blacking out, and then it flashes and the pace of the film like changes and stuff like that. You get this sense of disorientation. Is he being possessed by something? Is he two different spirits living inside the same body? I thought that was a very interesting thread that they started with. It doesn't necessarily play out as well as I wish it had, mainly because it seems to become a crutch and a cheat for them to use later on in the story. to get around explaining things or showing how things happen. Because more than once as the show progresses, they're like, we're kind of written in a corner. Let's do the thing. And then he wakes up and we just tell everybody he can't remember and we'll just keep moving. And it does come off then at the end of it as they started down this road and then they couldn't decide how to resolve it. And so while I enjoyed it at the get-go, since it doesn't play to a satisfying conclusion in terms of how they use that, I wind up saying instead that it winds up feeling like a little bit of a cheat. The way that they do it. It feels too much plot devicey rather than character moment.
It's such an interesting thing for me because, coming into this, not really knowing anything about the character and just being given this, right, and trying to digest it, especially the first time. And even coming into it the second time, even though I know the story, I still found the character of Stephen Grant to be so utterly annoying to me at the beginning of the series. And I'm sure that's probably on purpose, but it was very difficult because I still find him super obnoxious until, the end of the series where, he's kind of come into his own and him and Mark are copacetic and he's not obnoxious. I don't know. I don't know if it's something to which it's probably very close to the comic it's based off of and everything like that, as this character is trying to figure out what's going on. But I really have a hard time with the beginning of the show because of that. Once we start to get the answers, especially once we get the full answer as to how Steven actually exists in the first place, that Mark is actually the real person and Steven is his creation to keep him safe and to give him a quote-unquote normal existence, I think is fascinating. I think that becomes much more interesting. It's the beginning of the show where I really struggle with, for me personally, just watching this character. And I think it's I'm sure that this is on purpose, but I think that in some ways they almost do it too well because I had a very difficult time at the beginning of this show, like actually just even watching it because I just, the character is so frustrating. I find it interesting. I hear what you're saying. This plays a little bit to me like how I know that you find C-3PO annoying in the original trilogy, and I'm like, bro, what are you talking about? He's funny. So that comes down to a taste thing. And like, I want to be clear that what I'm talking about, the stuff that's not successful, that feels too plot devicey, is the fact that when they're backed into a corner, they push that button so that they can fast forward past it. I'm not talking about any of because there is interesting character stuff that they do with it. I think what you're talking about most likely could have been resolved by something that I felt was apparent through the entire thing, which is something that you and I have wrestled a little bit with as we've been talking on Aggressive Negotiations about the Obi-Wan series, the Obi-Wan Kenobi series. This is a movie's worth of material stretched out over too many episodes. Yes. Thank you. I'm glad that you mentioned that because I absolutely do think that is the case here. And I think, we've talked in this show specifically about other series that they've had as a Disney Plus series where, yes, did it work well? We just, we discussed Hawkeye and we both, I think, felt that worked well as a series. You could use some tightening up here and there, yada, 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 as most every show probably could. But it felt like it had earned the right to actually be a series. We talked about, though, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, where we felt like if you had turned this into a film, a 2.5-hour film, we both felt like it would have worked better. Loki, it felt like we were on the fence. It could have been maybe a movie, but in the end, it kind of also seemed like maybe just some tightening would have actually helped. Maybe 4 episodes instead of, I think, 6 or whatever. But I think this is absolutely one where you nailed it. I feel that this should just be a movie.
Which involves cutting some characters down out of this, too. It gets a little too muddled with everybody's arcs and everything. And additionally, I think that maybe that's it. Maybe we put our finger on it this time. We know that when Disney Plus was being developed and being announced, that Chapek makes the decision. I think Iger had something to do with the decision too. That's it. We're in the streaming business now. I'm willing to bet Moon Knight is, I think, a lot of projects we've seen come out as series were things that were in development as films, and they said, no, we got the streaming thing coming up. I love the script, add to it and stretch it out. And the thing is, you can't do that. Like when you break the story, I think this even works as a I will go against myself too. I think this could kind of work as a series if it was 3 or 4 episodes. It's the number of episodes where it begins to feel tedious and stretched out, and there are too many things inserted. And there's this weird variation of, what I affectionately call the Batman Returns syndrome, which didn't really start with Batman Returns, but kind of started with Lethal Weapon 2. It's a variation. Instead of a too many villains confrontation at the end, there's like a too many heroes confrontation at the end. It's when Oscar Isaac and Ethan Hawke, 2 of the best actors working in modern day cinema, 2 of the most gifted. I'm sorry for using the word best. I know that's I think 2 of the most gifted actors working in cinema today, especially Ethan Hawke. I love Ethan Hawke. The guy is a fearless, dedicated, incredible actor. He is undervalued as an actor, in my estimation. People know his name, but he's not achieved the level of stardom that I would want somebody to achieve who has his level of talent. When Hawke and Isaac are on screen together, and you got these 2 people working, it's insane how well it works. It is absolutely insane how well it works. And it makes it frustrating when they start adding more things and people in, reducing their opportunity to interact. This is like a Heath Ledger, Christian Bale, or when you finally get Pacino and De Niro together sort of moment, where it's like, I want as much time just focused on these 2 as possible because their conflict is fascinating. And the way that these actors play it is fascinating. And then they just bolt on these other things that just feel so unnecessary, including other characters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question too, with you bringing that up. What are the characters that work for you here alongside those 2? And what are the ones that just didn't end up working for you?
I mean, obviously, I think Oscar Isaac does a great job. I think Ethan Hawke does a great job. I could have done without certain. Look, the thing is, it's not the fault of the actors when I'm talking about these things, right? I want that to be extremely clear, is that I'm never going after the actors or the actresses because they're doing their job, and it's not even necessarily their performance that sort of like drags it. It's, because when you have all of these things going on and you have, I think her name is, May Kalamawi. Is that her name? Layla? This is again, to get back to the Batman Returns thing, right? If you look at Batman Returns and you break it down, if you had just Penguin and Batman, that's an incredible movie. If you had just Catwoman and Batman, that's an incredible movie. You put Penguin and Catwoman in the same movie, and the movie starts to lose its focus. And I think that's what's going on here, is like Layla doesn't drive the story the way that I think they intended her to. And I think that they get to the end and they turn them into a crime-fighting duo, and it doesn't feel right. It just doesn't feel right to me. I think that I go back and forth on Khonshu, whether I need to see him. It's interesting, but is it more interesting just as a voice until the end to have an, oh my gosh, you're real sort of moment? Like if Oscar Isaac, if Mark and Steven also have Khonshu talking to them, you have a character sitting there saying, wait, is this just another voice in my head? That sort of thing. I think that, those are really the core characters, aren't they? It's like, I'm not dragging any of the performances. I just think that the script doesn't mesh them well enough.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying. And I don't think that any of them needs to be excised. But what I find is that I think that because of what we're talking about a few minutes ago, about this should have been a film, I think that if you had put this together as a film, everything would be given the right amount of time, right? Because you only have 2.5 hours, and therefore you have to be very judicious with the amount of time any character's on screen, and they have to be serving the plot to have them on screen. And so, I think all the characters as they're here are obviously important to the story as the way that they're telling it. I think it becomes more about the way in which it's presented, and that many times it just feels like there's a way to get to a place faster than the scripts allow us to, because we need to fill up 6 episodes and each of these episodes is around 50 minutes.
Too long.
And so, exactly. And so, I think there's something to be said here for just, even with 6 episodes, which I'm glad they weren't trying to stretch this to like 9. I think it still feels like too many. At most, you could have done this as a 4-episode arc, and I think it would have been much more successful, because you're having to figure out, okay, what are the most important parts of the story here, and what's driving this? Obviously, the most important parts of this story are Steven and Mark trying to figure out what the heck is going on with their life, and then trying to stop, our main villain here, and that's it. The rest of everything is just side, right? And supposed to support that. And so I think that becomes an issue. I do want to ask you this question, because this is something to which I feel like has been an issue with Phase 4 so far. It seems as though we're just starting to throw everything in the kitchen sink into Marvel, instead of it having work into an overarching plan.
Yes.
And the reason I say that is, because first 2 phases, first 3 phases, for the most part, every character that we're introducing has a point to the end of the story that we're going for in Endgame. But in all honesty, as we're moving through phase 4, I'm beginning to ask myself, especially with this show, why are we introducing this character, and what does it have to do with anything that we've been doing already?
Yes, and yes. Because even though I might not have enjoyed phase 4 a whole lot, at the very least, there seems to be an effort on some of the like Falcon and the Winter Soldier, WandaVision, Spider-Man No Way Home, very clearly dealing with the aftermath of what happened in phase 3. And Eternals arguably is dealing with that by kind of not really doing anything successfully well, but outside of that, like, they at least address it. Like, the overall theme of phase 4 up to this point has been, what does this universe look like now that Endgame has happened? Now that people have gone through this shared trauma of the snap, have gone through all of these sorts of things, Moon Knight doesn't address any of that. Moon Knight seems to exist in its own little world, to the point where by the time we get to the end, it feels a bit like Wonder Woman 1984, where I'm wondering, is this still rooted in the same cinematic universe I was participating in? Like, you had my buy-in. Am I still doing that game? Are we still playing this, or are we through with that now?
No, I think that's an excellent point. And I think the problem is that, you know, this is also the first show where we're on Disney Plus, and yet we're trying to be darker and I would say a lot grittier. And, you know, with our fight scenes, even with, of course, the very beginning of the show where he's pouring glass into his shoes, and
which is brilliant. I thought that was brilliant. I was immediately interested. What's going on with this guy?
Which we're, you know, and in many ways, it feels like what they're trying to do is mimic the shows that we had on Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the problem, again, just becomes is that, you know, we have been trained that everything in the MCU matters for the whole. And I can't figure out how this relates to the whole at all, because it doesn't seem to care about anything else other than itself, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Whereas I think we would both say that the Guardians movies had done a great job of being their own thing, and yet at the same time doing enough that made you feel like they were a part of the universe that you're in. And this just feels like this would have been great if you had just been like, yeah, this is you know, an alternate universe, you know, thing that may or may not ever have anything to do with anything else. We just think it's a cool story, and you know, it's worth doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the thing that I was really struck by with this show, because I also feel like that the beginning of the series, it really wants to be grounded and gritty and like darker and moodier. And by the end of the series, it's completely lost all that. And it's a show that tonally doesn't know what it wants to be, because it's trying to have its cake and eat it too by being dark, but at the same time, by the end, feeling like, you know, a goofy comic book movie.
Yes, I think by the end, the resolution of it, because I sent you a message while I was watching it, which, you know, if you know, I sent AYFKM, because the ending of it felt like a 1990s comic book ending. Oh, we've got the two giant gods fighting, and the purplish blue laser beams flying everywhere, and the impossible enhanced acrobatics and the this and the that. And it's like, to have a series that so obviously had such an interesting, character-driven conflict at its core, by the end of this, as you're adequately pointing to, my question is not even in terms of the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a whole, but I'll reflect the question back to you. On the whole, what was the point of this show? Did it say anything about heroism? Did it say anything about sacrifice? Did it say anything about anything other than these are neat ideas? What was the reason for this series other than to make a series? And I think that anybody would be hard pressed to watch it and say, oh, I know the answer. Now, see, Loki, that very much seems like it's a very whimsical thing, but it does have some undercurrents. The anti-hero lessons, the questions about motivation and duality, the questions about doing evil in the face of good, and good being evil because it's pursuing its ends through the wrong means, sort of thing. So there's some interesting stuff going on there, and Moon Knight seems to want to get to it because there is that question, with Ammit and, Ammit's followers. Oh, well, we're judging them based on what they are going to do in the future. We're pulling up the weeds from the garden. And so we're left with a series that seems to have been wanting to ask the question, when does an action become evil if it's in the name of a greater good? Which is an interesting question to ask. How far can you go before it's too far? And it toys with the idea, and I think Ethan Hawke thought that was the idea, but it doesn't deliver. It doesn't stick that landing.
Yeah, I mean, I like that you bring up the philosophical questions here, because the difference between Khonshu and Ammit is that Khonshu only judges those who have already done these horrendous actions and basically deserve death, the death penalty. And Ammit judges people before they've done the actions, so they don't have the ability to do them. And the biggest issue with that is that then what you're saying, at least what Ammit's saying, and we never deal with this idea, is the fact that can't somebody change? Isn't that kind of what the MCU has been all about? Is when you have a character like Tony Stark who goes from being a raving narcissist to being somebody who's willing to give up his life and his wife and his child for the galaxy and the universe at large? I mean, that's the biggest story of redemption in this whole saga, right? And so, but if you had judged Tony Stark beforehand, wouldn't... The problem is that it really doesn't deal with the biggest questions here, which is that what Ammit's saying is that everything is predestined and nobody can change, right? And that... And Tony Stark then, in her worldview, would be somebody who is always going to do that, and therefore would be able to be judged, I guess, a good person, So I think the problem is that, like we've kind of called out on this series before, we also do Snyder cuts. This show specifically is asking really huge questions that it doesn't actually want to deal with at all.
Mm-hmm.
And whereas, you get all of some serious questions in like the Snyder films, all of them, not just his DC work, right? And it's willing to plumb the depths. And I think that's the problem here, is that we're not willing to plumb the depths of the type of question that we've raised. Mm-hmm. And then we kind of just abandon it at the end for spectacle. And it doesn't all seem to fit together, because you do have this wonderful moment of, Mark and Steven being able to come together, mm-hmm. right? And yet that doesn't even quite seem to fit with everything that we're going through and the questions that we're asking. And I don't know. I think the problem is that it feels just kind of like a muddied mess when it comes to the actual thematic elements of the series that you've, I think, rightly pinpointed.
It's just such a shame. And I think that, what you're saying comes to a head when Mark makes the decision not to kill, and I apologize, Arthur Harrow makes the decision not to kill Arthur, played by Ethan Hawke. It is suddenly Layla's like, no, you don't have to do it. And he's like, yeah, you do it. And it's more about the fact that he just doesn't want Khonshu to manipulate him. It has nothing to do with him proving that I don't have to do this thing because it's not the right thing to do. And even impart that lesson to Arthur and say, you would have seen this moment and said, I had no choice, but I do. And I'm choosing now. And so you leave with that question as well, though. It's like, well, would he have seen the evil? Like there's never any moment where Arthur is taught the lesson that Amit's vision is not perfect, that it is in fact imperfect. And it maybe is kind of hinted at when she says, oh, your scales are not balanced, but I'm going to use you anyway. But there's no real moment of him coming to the realization of saying, wait a minute, she doesn't actually care. She's not just pulling the weeds. She's going to take up some flowers too, because sometimes you got it, like that sort of thing. And have his faith shook. So, that I think that's a missed opportunity. And then since we're on the ending again, just to go back, like there's so many different points of it really feels like they couldn't decide. Is the truly climactic thing Mark deciding not to kill him, but not teaching a lesson? Is it that they figure out the secret spell that gets rid of Amet? Is it that they defeat Arthur because Steven's heart is too good, but his heart isn't too good because he blacks out and this mystery third personality takes over and kills everyone? So that's not really awesome. Like, it's, I don't know. I'm sorry to double back to talking about the ending again, but I think that ties into it, where it's like, it's just this big mishmash of things put together. And probably if it had been a film, that still wouldn't have resolved itself, but it would have been done a lot faster, and I probably would have been more forgiving.
Right. Well, and there's something that still, the second time watching through this series, just drives me up a wall. And it's the stupidity of the way in which they get rid of Khonshu in the middle of the series. There is no reason whatsoever on any universe, that we have to have him turn back the sky when you can have an app for that. There's an app for that shows you what the night sky looked like thousands of years ago. Because it's just math. And so the fact that these programs existed and that we're going to use this as the reason that we're going to get rid of this character who can help us throughout the rest of the series just is infuriatingly maddening to me. It's writing that's just stupid. And that bothers me when there's something so dumb in a series, because you could go find that online. Literally could just go look it up on your phone. What does the night sky look like, in AD 63? I mean, BC, whatever. It's just stupid. And I think that kind of the thing that we've been getting at this whole time is that the script itself for this series, one, seems so stretched out, but two, to not really have nailed down what the important elements are in the story as in character themes. and then overall thematic elements, and how are we finding a way to make that tight and clear throughout the entire thing. And I'm, you know, I was listening to an interview with James Gunn on a podcast, and he was talking about that he doesn't believe that there is such a thing as superhero fatigue, but he said that he thinks that we're getting to the point of like people just getting tired of the same thing over and over again. And I think that he's right, because Moon Knight, like you said, is full of issues that we saw in films back in the 90s. I mean, we talked about Batman Forever here together in the 602 Club, and Batman and Robin. And, you know, we've talked about some of these 90s films that just had some serious issues to them. And this series seems to have learned none of the lessons that it should have. And especially when we have talked about some of the films here, the MCU, which have really done such a good job of tracking character development and the thematic elements. I think of the Guardians films. I think of the Captain America films. All three of those play very well together. Whether I like Iron Man 2 or not, the Iron Man 1, 2, and 3 create a very interesting arc for Tony Stark that then, of course, gets wrapped up in Endgame. And so, like, you think of the way in which we've been following these characters, and this TV show is basically 3 movies in one, and it just can't seem to find its way to adequately portray the arcs that we would want in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's a shame, because I think that the core of this, like you said, if they were forced to be more disciplined, sometimes giving real constraint to a creative team makes them shine. They don't have 6 episodes. You don't have 6 episodes. You got 2 hours. You got to tell this in 2 hours. Well, I have a big story to tell. Well, you better think of like a really creative way to tell it. And I think that again, I mean, it's frustrating, because it feels like I'm being dismissive. I know that a lot of creative people and a lot of talented people worked on this show. I just don't think that it gels. Whose feet do you lay that at? Do you lay it at Marvel's feet for forcing them to make a 6-episode series when this should have been a movie? Do you lay it at the feet of the limitations of the volume that are becoming more apparent with this? This filmed in the volume, didn't it?
I would think so, because, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I do think another problem with this is the effects in here look pretty terrible.
I won't go so far as to say terrible. I will go so far as to say unfinished. It looks rushed. It looks honestly the way that Marvel as a whole has seen its effects work become more reflective of the attitude that I jokingly refer to the Disney execs having of, F it, you're going to watch it anyway. I exempt a few of the franchise. I thought the effects in No Way Home were great on the whole. I thought that, I've always been pleased with what James Gunn does. I think he has a really good eye for effects and getting them right. I think that the push for content and the tight production schedules and the need to feed the content monster leads to results like the Moon Knight character being CG in certain shots when he doesn't need to be. And I can tell it's CG. And the backgrounds not lining up with their perspectives properly, or the lighting not working quite as well as they would think, and there's not enough depth on that background. at times. Those sorts of things I really think are just a function of you have until Tuesday and you're going to deliver it on Tuesday. And as good as it is on Tuesday is how we're going to release it. And that's it. And we're going to keep moving because you got another project to work on.
Yeah, I think that's a great point in the sense that what we see here is too much content coming out. And I think that's one of the biggest issues that I have with this series as a whole even existing, is the fact that this seems like content for content's sake.
Mm-hmm.
Because I can't see how this matters to the rest of what we're doing. And it's not a problem if that's the case, but the problem is that the MCU has taught me to only ask that question. How does this play into the rest of the whole?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And this doesn't seem to have an answer to that question.
And what's most unfortunate is I should be able to come into an entertainment and not have that question on my head and say, I just want to come and enjoy this. And unfortunately, because of what they've trained me to expect, I find myself, like you just said, having trouble coming at it and just judging it on its own merit completely, and not also add in, but where does it go overall? And then when it doesn't go anywhere overall, then it seems to be a failure, when in fact, maybe it's a success of the creative team to come in and do exactly what we've always wanted them to do, which is to do something new and original without feeling obligated to tie it into something else, to just tell a story. That's exactly what we all want, right? Just tell me a good story. And I think that, it just winds up, it's weird. Maybe Moon Knight is that sort of perfect symptom of the hole that Marvel has dug itself into, where it set a certain type of expectation. And then, as with Eternals and Moon Knight now, it's tried to subvert that expectation. And that is working against it specifically because we're both sitting here and we keep coming back. Where does it fit? Where does it fit? And the only reason I'm asking that is because they taught me that I should watch everything saying, where does it fit? Where does it fit?
Well, and I think, to me, the thing that frustrates me the most is that, again, Disney has done Oscar Isaac dirty by not giving him what he deserves as an actor.
Listen.
I mean, come on. The guy, if you've seen Ex Machina with him.
Yeah, Ex Machina, he's great. And
So
A Most
good.
Violent Year.
Yeah.
He's phenomenal
So
in A
good.
Most Violent
Yeah.
Year.
I mean, he's an incredible
I-
actor, and he makes the most of everything you give him.
Stunningly good. Mhm.
It's-
He's great in the show.
Yeah.
He's great. He and Ethan Hawke, again, are magnificent in what they're doing. They showed up and they knew what their mission statement was for these characters and what they were going to do. And they make incredibly good choices, incredibly successful choices. And it's just the material. I mean, let's go with another. Unfortunately, it is Disney property, but like the sequel trilogy, nothing that happens there is Oscar Isaac's fault. In fact, I'd say that he brings Poe to life. I believe that Poe exists as a person. Poe Dameron is a dude. And I'm fully on board with, I'd even watch more stories. If you said there's going to be a Poe Dameron series, as much as I have ambivalent feelings about the sequel trilogy, I would say, okay, I'll give that a shot. I'll try it out. Sure. Okay. But yeah, this is just another vehicle. Maybe Oscar Isaac spends time here with Ethan Hawke and they both come to the realization, Ethan Hawke comes to the realization that no matter what he was going to do, he was never going to be able to infuse into the Disney sensibility what he hoped to bring with his approach to things. And Oscar Isaac will see that and say, you know what? Maybe I will just follow your lead and go make things like Gattaca and the Before trilogy and all of these other things that you're known for that are great, that you just don't care whether they make bank.
Yeah.
You're just going to go out there and make art.
I mean, he should. He's that kind of actor. Now, I'm interested then with all the discussion we've had of where you are going to land with a rating for Moon Knight.
It will wind up being more generous than people might think after listening to me, specifically because what I will call it, because there are elements that are so intriguing, and the bones here at certain things are intriguing, and the villain is so intriguing, and the Mark Steven thing is so interesting. It actually, for all of the complaining I just did over the last nearly hour, it winds up walking away relatively unscathed with a 2.5. It's an interesting failure. Sort of the way I wind up feeling about David Lynch's Dune, where I'm like, I don't like really what's happening here, but there's some really interesting stuff happening. It doesn't come together. I can't ever call it good, but at the same time, I can't just outright dismiss the thing. So I wind up giving it a 2.5. What about you?
I'm actually at the same exact place. I think this is half an interesting show. Half of it's good, and I think the other half of it's actually kind of terrible. And the problem is you put those two together, and it's very frustrating then just watching it, especially having seen this before. I just found myself, I don't know if it's more frustrated, but similarly frustrated as I was the first time, which is never a good place to be, right? I was hoping that I would come into this and maybe something would stand out to me in a different way, and it just didn't. And so, 2.5. But that means I can't wait to see then where this falls in your rankings of the MCU.
There's an extra thing that's going to happen with this ranking that's going to shock so many people too. Because by fiat, I shall decree that where this winds up being placed on the list winds up making me go back and revise a rating for a movie which had a lower star rating before. I know. It's so weird.
I can't wait now.
All right. So here we go with the list. Captain America, the Winter Soldier, Iron Man 3, Spider-Man No Way Home, Ant-Man, Guardians of the Galaxy 2, Iron Man, Avengers Infinity War, Black Panther, Guardians of the Galaxy, Hawkeye, Doctor Strange, Loki, Civil War, Captain America, the First Avenger, Ant-Man and the Wasp, The Incredible Hulk, Avengers Infinity War, Thor, Shang-Chi, Spider-Man Homecoming, Avengers. Howard the Duck gets bumped up to 2.5.
Wow.
Because likewise,
an
interesting failure goes from 2 to 2.5 because I realized that weighing different factors, including rating and rewatchability, after Howard the Duck appears Moon Knight. Because again, I can't call it good, but there's some interesting stuff failing here that makes me come back and like, would I rewatch Moon Knight? Yeah, I probably would rewatch bits and pieces of it. If it was on, I'd be like, yeah, okay. And then after that is WandaVision, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Spider-Man Far From Home, Thor, The Dark World, Iron Man 2, Thor, Ragnarok, Avengers, Age of Ultron, Black Widow, Captain Marvel, and eternally at the bottom, Eternals.
All right, so Captain America, the Winter Soldier, Iron Man 3, No Way Home, Endgame, Civil War, The First Avenger, Black Panther, Guardians of the Galaxy 2, Ant-Man, Hawkeye, What If, Doctor Strange, Shang-Chi, and The Incredible Hulk, which is now on Disney+, Guardians of the Galaxy, Spider-Man Homecoming, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Loki, Avengers, Spider-Man Far From Home, Infinity War, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Thor the Dark World, Iron Man 2, Thor, Howard the Duck, then Moon Knight, Black Widow, Age of Ultron, Captain Marvel, WandaVision, Ragnarok, and of course, because it's Eternals, the bottom, Eternals.
You know, it's so interesting that we wind up putting Howard the Duck and Moon Knight next to each other.
Maybe Leah Thompson has something to do with it. I don't know, but
No, hey, I'm just saying, like, it's interesting how we both look at them and we're like, these are both interesting failures, but the key word being interesting. Because we recognize somebody was trying at the very least.
Well, and I'm just more likely to watch Howard the Duck again than I am ever to watch Moon Knight again.
Yeah, but they're still right next to each other.
It's true.
Is what I'm
it's
saying.
True.
You know? So, I'm just saying. It's interesting.
It is very interesting, John. And if people wanted to talk to you about interesting things, where would they find you?
Oh, they can find me being uninteresting online. It's Kessel Junkie. Look for me on Letterboxd. I also lurk on Twitter because it's the drug I cannot quit for some reason. And you can find me over on the Nerd Party Network co-hosting 2 shows, one called House Lights, where we look at the work of directors, and a show called Aggressive Negotiations that I co-host with you, Matthew Rushing.
Well, I hope people will check that out. It's so much fun. You can find me all over social media under the name MattRushing02. Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, and Vera are the places I am most active. Of course, I'm here on the network inside the 602 Club, talking about all of the fandoms we love, as well as outside of that on Literary Treks, about the books and the comics of Star Trek. The Orb, we're going through the 30th anniversary rewatch of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Orb 5, the 20th anniversary rewatch of Star Trek Enterprise. The Artificial Tango, about Star Trek Picard. And Saddle Up. It's about to be back next week as we're recording this because Strange New Worlds Season 2 has just started. And then over on the Nerd Party Network, you'll find me on Owlpost with Drea Kaufman as we talked about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. But thank you so much for joining us.
Avengers?